Well, hello, Carrie. I just want to first off thank you for such an insightful post as this week as we talk about existential versus Gestalt therapy. Very great post, very straightforward with lots of facts. I really appreciate it. I just took some notes here and wanted to reply to you after watching your video. So one of the first things that you mentioned was that with both of these theories, there's a freedom and responsibility that the client has to make their own choices. And as you were saying that, something that I didn't think about when I did my research and was crewmating my video was that this is kind of underlined in the code of ethics with autonomy. The client has the autonomy to choose and to choose what they want to do and the outcomes of therapy and things like that. So these approaches really highlight that main core value us as counselors hold for autonomy for the client with their freedom and responsibility to choose, which I thought was interesting. You also go on to share that clients go on to gain awareness and it leads them to make decisions. And what I was thinking about was, again, it goes back to that autonomy, but it's an autonomy based in the client's values. As they become more aware about themselves and their feelings and what they value, they then can make informed decisions and choices for their own life and have that autonomy and that freedom, like you shared. With that awareness and that freedom, it opens up an opportunity for choices that they make to bring more meaning to their life. So as they become more aware, have the autonomy and the freedom and the responsibility to make their own choices, it kind of allows them to make choices that bring more meaning into their life, which is explained in the TAN textbook. You also go on to state that existential may not work well for counselors, new counselors, because it lacks technique, which I thought was pretty interesting. Something that I had not mentioned was we both know that existential is very vague, doesn't have many techniques, it's more of a philosophy. So for new therapists that are more technique driven, this approach may not work well for new counselors or counselors in training like ourselves. We may lean more towards ones that offer a lot, like behavioral or cognitive behavioral therapy. So I thought that was interesting as well. When we look at Gestalt techniques, as we know, there's a lot of them, including feed me a sentence and the empty chair technique and hold that feeling, all those. Something interesting that you mentioned, that Gestalt therapy can be tailored and it's very open and flexible to many cultural backgrounds, which I thought was interesting. And something I added here based on what you shared was that I feel like it can be tailored to fit many other theories and approaches to therapy. So even if your orientation is not Gestalt therapy, you may lean more person-centered or even cognitive behavioral or whatever, you can still incorporate these techniques into that theory. So I thought that was another way that Gestalt was very flexible, not only culturally, but using the techniques in a way that can fit into several different forms of therapy and many different cultures, as you shared, which kind of gives an integration piece to Gestalt. Something that you mentioned that I thought was interesting, a weakness for Gestalt, was that role-playing. While it is a very good technique, especially the chair one, it can be a problem for clients at certain times because it can be hard for them to imagine up certain things or put themselves in a moment where they're talking to someone or talking to part of themselves, which I thought was interesting. Something that I had read in TAN that kind of correlated with that was that when counselors don't have proper training in these techniques, there can be some insensitivities based on the client you're dealing with, and it can cause more damage than good. So it's very important for us as counselors in training and any counselor out there to be properly trained in these techniques as to not do more damage to the client. So we want to be sensitive to the client and their emotional needs, but also their cultural and social needs as well when we think about these things. Again, like I mentioned, or you mentioned as well, we're talking about Mark 12:31, as it talks about love and care is the foundation of the existential relationship. You know, using this approach is fundamental to the therapeutic alliance. Being loving and caring and genuine and authentic, as we're called to do, as the Bible calls us to do. And then you also mentioned John 8:32, which I thought was also great, talking about being authentic. Being authentic with who you are, and being open and vulnerable in that, like the Bible talks about. So that's something I mentioned as well, and I saw that you put it as well, so I thought that was interesting. Something that you also mentioned was that kind of a downside to being authentic with these approaches is that truth can be very subjective. And us as believers, as Christians, know that God's truth is the only truth. But when, something you shared, when truth is subjective, then it really comes down to the person, what is right or wrong, and it can cause some issues, So I thought that was interesting that you had mentioned. And kind of lastly here, one last point that I took away from your video was that existential can be too vague when creating outcomes for pathology and psychopathology, which is something I also mentioned in my video. But when I kept reading through the material, something that popped up based on what you had shared was that with existential therapy, not only is it too vague, but it can be very intense, mostly for clients, but also it's more suitable for a long-term approach. So it's too vague, it can be quite intense emotionally for clients, and it can be quite a long-term process, even though it can be tailored to short-term, which can cause a lot of financial issues, maybe even a dependency on the therapist at times, and it might not deal with certain more practical needs of the client, needs that need to be addressed more immediately. So that was just something that I thought about when you brought up that point. These are just my thoughts and some notes I had taken based on your video. Again, thank you so much for sharing, and I look forward to hearing more from you in the future. Have a blessed week.